What is the best operating system for a gaming computer? Now this is a question that could get you pretty much shot in the face if you're in the wrong neighborhood. But this question becomes even more relevant if you're looking at like gaming handheld PCs like the Rog Ally or the Lenovo Legion Go, for example, that I have over here. And what I've done for this video is that I've loaded up a copy of SteamOS using the Bazzite distribution that I am dual booting with Windows 11. And in this video, I'm going to use this to test how the performance differs on SteamOS, like Bazzite and Windows 11 on the Lenovo Legion Go. So a couple of things to mention before going into the actual performance testing is that the difference in user experience that you're going to get with SteamOS and Windows 11. One of the things that people don't really like about Windows 11 is the actual user experience for gaming handhelds, because Windows 11 is like a desktop operating system and it is not optimized to be used on like smaller screens with controllers and so on. Whereas something like SteamOS, it's specifically made to be used with controllers and more specifically for a handheld gaming device. And I think why a lot of people think that installing SteamOS on a Windows-based handheld, you're gonna get like better battery life or better performance is the sheer amount of things that you have to do by yourself, like manually on Windows 11 to make it like actually usable for a handheld gaming device. And this includes like basic optimizations that you're gonna go into like Windows 11 and do by yourself, like disabling core isolation and virtual machines and so on. And you also have to deal with a whole bunch of crap that comes with Windows, like bloatware and useless processes that run that you're never going to use on a handheld PC. Whereas I think with SteamOS, it's like completely the opposite. You have to jump through hoops to install like basic things like a web browser or like a document viewer or things like that. Or you're going to switch to the desktop interface to basically go into your browser and download stuff. But yeah, and in this video we're going to see whether or not that actually makes a difference on the actual gaming performance, which is the one thing that this device has to be good at least, right? And the second thing I want to mention before going into the actual testing is that some people think that the battery life on SteamOS has to be somehow like magically better than on Windows, but to be fair, like yes, Windows is running actually a lot of background processes that may be eating up some of your CPU resources and your battery life. But in real life scenario, it's not that different because the majority of the stress on the battery and the wattage you're pulling is going to be coming from the games that you're playing with the amount of TDP that you have set in your settings. So what this basically means is that if you run, for example, SteamOS on 20 watts and then Windows on 20 watts, you're basically going to see very similar battery life, maybe like a 10-minute difference, which isn't going to make a huge amount of difference. Alright, so with that, let's move into the more interesting part of the video, which is going to be looking at a bunch of different games on Bazzite and on Windows, and then make our minds whether we like the performance on one better than on the other, for example. And for the testing, we're going to use both on Bazzite and on Windows. We're going to do on the balanced mode, which is 15 watts. So we're going to do 15 watts on Windows and on Bazzite. And then we're going to do on the performance mode, which is 20 watts, both 20 watts in Windows and 20 watts in Bazzite. And as I have mentioned in my previous videos, I'm not going to even bother with like the higher resolutions like 2560 by 1600 because I think that's not realistic for a device like this. And so both in Bazzite and in Windows, I'm just going to be using 1280 by 800 for all of the games that we're going to look at today. And in both cases, I'm just going to be using integer scaling to scale from 1280 by 800 to the actual screen size, which is going to give us a bit of pixelation, but I think it's completely fine if you're holding the device at a reasonable distance from your face. But yeah, without further ado, let's just jump into looking at some cool charts, shall we? Alright, so starting off with Assassin's Creed Mirage. As I already said, I'm going to be using 1280 by 800 resolution. I have VSync turned off, I have FPS caps turned off, and I am using my own custom mix of settings of medium and high. So this basically allows me to cap my FPS at 48 and play without any stutters or any issues. But as you can see, both at 15 watts and at 20 watts, Windows seems to be giving us like better average FPS figures. And this is actually going to be a trend for most of the other games that we're going to be testing today. And is that Windows gives us a better average FPS, usually in most cases. But then the minimum FPS or the 1% lows are pretty similar between Windows and Bazzite. And this is because Bazzite usually is a less stuttery experience compared to Windows. And so this is basically the trade-off that you're going to be making, I think, between Windows 11 at the moment with the current drivers versus Bazzite, is that you're going to be trading off like consistency and stuttering. So whether having a lower consistent FPS is better, for example, in your opinion, than having a higher FPS on average, but then getting some stutters in the process. But yeah, I think with these settings on Windows 11, Assassin's Creed is pretty much very playable. And on Bazzite, I think one of the issues that gives us a bit lower of an FPS could be because we're sideloading basically the Ubisoft Connect launcher. And it's almost like we're running the launcher itself with like compatibility settings with Proton Experimental, I think, in order to be able to run the Assassin's Creed game from inside the launcher. And this is because Assassin's Creed Mirage isn't available on Steam. So that pretty much locks you out of like all of non-Steam games, including Assassin's Creed Mirage on Bazzite or SteamOS. But yeah, moving on to Cyberpunk 2077, and what we're seeing is pretty similar overall trend to like what we saw before. And that is that with Windows, we're getting on average like higher average FPS, both at 15 watts and at 20 watts. And in case of Cyberpunk, I'm also running this on 1280 by 800. I'm using, again, my own custom mix of settings, which is basically Steam Deck settings with a few things set like higher than the Steam Deck settings, because the Legion Go can push a bit more power than the Steam Deck, for example. And once again, what we're seeing is a pretty significant difference between the average FPSs and then pretty similar like minimum FPSs, as was the case, for example, with Assassin's Creed Mirage as well. But I'd say in the case of Cyberpunk, both on Bazzite and Windows 11, it's a pretty playable experience overall. And I'm saying this with like my settings and with like 1280 by 800 resolution and to integer scaling and so on. So the last benchmark game that we're going to look at today is going to be Red Dead Redemption 2, which in the case of Windows versus Bazzite also had the issue of like Bazzite or SteamOS not being able to run this game in DirectX 12 mode, or it's gonna crash. So what we're looking at is like exactly the same settings, with the only difference being like DirectX 12 for Windows and Vulkan for SteamOS. And with Red Dead Redemption 2 as well, what we're seeing is that the average FPSs again are higher with Windows, although they are close, I think, whereas the minimum FPS is pretty much like non-existent on Windows, and it's like 3 times higher with Bazzite, which basically means like a less stutter of an experience overall. And I think the last game we're gonna look at is gonna be Starfield, because I've had too much headache trying to run this consistently on SteamOS with Bazzite as compared to Windows 11. And I think this basically comes down to the optimization of like the FSR technology built into Starfield, because with Windows you can just turn on like frame generation as well and just not think about it, whereas with Bazzite, if you try turning on the frame generation feature, it gives you like a huge amount of stutter. And in my opinion, this basically makes Starfield unplayable pretty much on Bazzite. You can play it at like 23 watts if you want, but I think being able to get the exact same FPS on like Windows 11 at 15 watts is a huge difference. But yeah, I think for this reason alone, I would choose like Windows 11 over Bazzite, because the amount of hoops you have to jump to make like the custom settings work with the desktop mode on Bazzite, you have to go into like weird folder structures that basically tries to emulate Windows within Linux to find like the settings files and then modify your settings files to make it run better. Both on Windows and on Bazzite, I'm using like a custom INI file for the settings, which basically gives you a better experience for handhelds. And that's why in my settings menu, the preset is set to Ultra, where it's a mix of like optimized settings for a handheld PC. And I have the exact same settings both on Windows and on Bazzite, with the only difference being that on Windows you can pretty much turn on the frame generation feature and not think about it, whereas with Bazzite you cannot do that. Alright, so I think it has been like enough testing to be able to answer the question for ourselves whether we like Bazzite better or Windows better, whether you're gonna prioritize, for example, gaming performance versus user experience and like more stable performance, more consistent performance. For me, I think I'm gonna go back to Windows 11, so I'll just get rid of Bazzite at some point. And on Windows as well, you still have the option to customize it yourself and make it feel more like a console using like Play Night or Steam's big picture mode, or use like Legion Space, although it looks terrible. And with SteamOS, you still have this issue with like third-party launchers. So let's say you want to use like Ubisoft Connect to be able to play like Assassin's Creed Mirage. And the last thing I'd like to add is the performance difference that we saw in this video. It could also be due to how, for example, Bazzite and SteamOS allocates power to the CPU and the GPU, and how different it is on Windows, for example. And as you know, for example, if you set like 15 watts in Windows, it's actually going to be drawing a lot more for the total system power draw to use for the screen and all the other components of the system, and not only the CPU and the GPU. So for like 15 watts, it usually the total power draw is around like 23 or 22 watts. Although I am not sure and I can't test this, maybe it's the same, maybe it's different. But with the current settings, with the current performance profiles, I think I'm gonna stick with Windows 11 for the time being. But yeah, if you'd like me to test some more stuff between like Bazzite and Windows 11, be sure to drop a comment down below, while I still have Bazzite on my Legion Go, which I might delete pretty soon, so hurry up. But yeah, if you enjoyed the video, be sure to subscribe to the channel for more videos like this one, and hit the like button on this video just to make me feel better and because it's free. And I'll see you in the next one. Thank you for watching. Bye.